Howdy folks, Professor Snart just checking in as we move away from Unit 2 and into Unit 3, which is a little bit like Unit 2 in as much as it's not a major kind of writing assignment type of unit. It's really more of a building block, pardon me, kind of a unit. Now obviously in Unit 2 you're thinking about in the act of writing about that memory, you're thinking about how we take, in this case, a memory, but it could be, you know, an observation or just the details of everyday life or whatever, and kind of work it up in language to make it impactful or make it profound for somebody else, someone who didn't go through that same experience. In addition, then, I had you look at the how do I write sort of multimedia thing, which is in itself interesting as a piece of writing or, you know, that multimedia kind of thing, but it obviously invites questions about, you know, writing itself. So we're thinking about, you know, what it means to have the habits of a writer or to think or kind of view the world like a writer and all that kind of stuff. And even if you don't really think of yourself as a writer, whatever that means, whatever baggage that has for you, it is important that you sort of take yourself seriously as a writer, even if you're, you know, if you're uncomfortable with it, just do it for this course and you can abandon it after that. But it's not about thinking of yourself as more or less important because you're a writer, or now that you're a writer, you have to publish things, and thus if you don't publish, you're not a writer somehow. Thinking of yourself as a writer is really just taking what you do seriously as a craft, which is actually a nice segue into Unit 3. Which is called Language is Your Medium. And so it's, again, kind of a reflection unit, thinking about what are the component pieces of creative writing, right, in the most sort of foundational and fundamental ways. And so the thing that we're looking at here is metaphor, or that whole collection of comparative sort of devices, metaphor, simile, analogy, allegory, which is sort of like the bigger set of those things, but those basic comparisons, and they form maybe the most fundamental building block for almost any kind of writing that you would do, no matter what the genre is. So the writing component here is actually very short and easy to do, and you have a fairly long time to do it. But really the most important part is that you spend some time reflecting on exactly what, you know, metaphor, analogy, simile is, how do you see them, and really the writing part here is where you've encountered them before. So there's a couple of sort of fun video examples. I just built some new stuff in the unit, so if you were in earlier, you're going to want to go back and check it out. There's a Forrest Gump clip here that I haven't listened to this. Like, of course I know about it, but I haven't watched the thing for so long. Oh my God, it was hard. It's all of like a minute 30. And I love the movie, don't get me wrong. And I love Tom Hanks because he's Canadian and so am I, so we're sort of like bound to like each other. But anyway, it was tough. But it's the famous Life is Like a Box of Chocolates, which is a really ideal kind of example of a simile, right? One thing is like another, because it's so well known, I think, at this point. I think, honestly, we sort of get lost in the clichédness of it or the whole movie aspect of it, but it really is a sort of useful simile, or certainly an example of a simile for us, because it does work in such an obvious kind of way. One very concrete thing that you can hold in your hand, the box of chocolates, is compared or is used as a point of comparison for this much bigger abstract thing that you can't simply pick up and move around. So life being the very abstract thing, the box of chocolates being the very concrete thing, and that everyday item is used to sort of elucidate or tell us something about that abstract thing in a way that just more abstraction really doesn't. So it's funny that oftentimes the best similes are those that work with the biggest abstract thing, like life, the universe, and everything, but do so by investigating, by reference to the most mundane of items, things that we're all used to seeing and have this kind of approachability to them. So it works really nicely, and there's a little formula that I'm asking you to use here in terms of seeing how this one works, but also in terms of finding your own, is that you really need to run it through the test. Is the metaphor, analogy, simile, whatever you found, can it be broken down in terms of what is the abstract thing and what is the concrete thing? You have to have two pretty clear things on either side of that equation. And if your example doesn't fit into there, it might still work, but honestly, probably not. It might be a slightly different, figure of speech that you found, but not really what we're looking for. And I could go on at length, I won't, but there's really some important ways in which this basic building block of comparison is so intrinsic to why creative writing matters, to why we like it, to what purpose it serves in our lives. And again, the very short version is just that it sort of takes either things that are so big they're kind of unthinkable, like life or whatever, and makes them approachable. So we can talk about things that are really beyond us in ways that are not beyond us by reference to these sort of everyday things. But the very fundamental act of saying that one thing is or is like another, it also sort of reinvents the world for us every time we do it. And that's why you want to avoid the cliche, because if it's a cliched comparison, we don't even really think about it anymore as a comparison. In other words, it just becomes this phrase that we don't process as, okay, this one thing is like another, so now I have to do the mental work of like how those things go together. If it's a cliche, we've heard it so many times, we don't really do that mental work anymore, which defeats the purpose. Because again, the mental work that we do when we encounter a really great use of analogic language or language that compares one thing to another is that we see the world in a different way. And that sounds maybe sort of corny or whatever, but maybe too grandiose. But through our accumulation of use of and kind of observation with that kind of metaphoric language, always seeing things in terms of other things, it really does bring the world to life in a really important way. And so, again, the very longer version of that would involve a whole history of critics and artists who've, theorized about that and really tried to put it into practice and shown how it works and why it's important and why politically it's important and culturally and all that kind of stuff. But it's also, the short end of it is, the short version of it is just that the most important kind of value of creative writing, which we often discard as like, well, I have my important stuff and then I just creative write as a sort of escape, or I read stuff for an escape and not as part of the real world, that really does a disservice to creative writing, because in this fundamental way, our use of language, your use of language, it really does have a profound immediate impact on the quality of everyday life. And again, that sounds maybe a little bit grandiose, but it's not. I mean, it just isn't. Okay, so I'll stop. That's the short version, so you can imagine the long version. Anyway, have fun with these video clips. Have fun with the assignment. You have a long time to work on it for a fairly short amount of writing. And so in your search for a meaningful metaphor, simile, or analogy, be sure that you really don't just Google something. Like, that would be totally pointless, honestly. And don't just kind of default to the first thing that you encounter. Do try to use the time to be actively on the lookout for this type of language and find something that's meaningful to you. Be sure in your post you provide what that is. Give us some context and ideally something visual, whether it's a book cover, a video clip, maybe just a link to audio or to text if that's what we need. Explain the metaphor or simile in the way that I've explained it, or that I've asked you to explain it here in the assignment. And as always, be sure that you respond to at least 2 other students, and respond at length. Develop this response really is something, again, meaningful, but with as much sort of depth as your original post. So they should be roughly equal in length, actually. Okay, so that was and that's the short version. See? Lucky. Okay, be in touch with any questions, and I will talk to everybody soon.